What if everything you thought you knew about the fall of Rome was just the tip of the iceberg? From well-known invasions to whispers of apocalyptic plagues and secret betrayals, this video uncovers the darkest and most mysterious causes hidden beneath the surface of history's greatest collapse. The fall of the Roman Empire is one of history's most iconic stories, but there's so much more than what we read in textbooks. Today, we're diving into an iceberg with 5 layers, each revealing secrets about Rome's collapse. From common knowledge to shocking theories buried in time, we'll uncover what truly brought the empire to its knees. Stick with us to the end, and you'll see why this isn't just history. It's a puzzle we still can't fully solve. Tier 1. The surface economic instability. Economic instability is often cited as one of the most significant factors in the decline of the Roman Empire. But what exactly went wrong? On the surface, the economic troubles of Rome seem straightforward: overtaxation, inflation, and a crumbling infrastructure. Yet, when we delve deeper, we uncover a tangled web of systemic failures that not only destabilized the empire, but also made it vulnerable to external pressures. One of the most glaring issues was Rome's reliance on slave labor. The empire's economy was built on the backs of slaves who worked in agriculture, construction, and households. This system worked well during Rome's expansionist phase, as wars of conquest brought in a steady supply of enslaved people. However, as the empire ceased to expand, this source of labor dried up, creating shortages in key industries. Without new conquests, Rome faced an economic bottleneck, with its growth stalling as resources became increasingly scarce. Adding to this was the problem of wealth inequality. By the late empire, a vast majority of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few elite families, leaving the lower classes to bear the brunt of economic hardships. This disparity eroded social cohesion and led to widespread resentment. The empire attempted to address these issues through taxation, but this only deepened the crisis. Tax rates became so burdensome that many small landowners abandoned their farms, contributing to a decline in agricultural output, a critical sector for the empire. Inflation was another major factor in Rome's economic decline. To fund its military campaigns and administrative expenses, the empire resorted to debasing its currency. Silver and gold coins were increasingly mixed with cheaper metals, reducing their value. Over time, this led to runaway inflation as people lost confidence in the currency. Prices soared, trade diminished, and the economy entered a downward spiral. The famous Edict of Diocletian in 301 AD, which attempted to control inflation by setting maximum prices for goods and services, only exacerbated the problem. Instead of stabilizing the economy, it led to black markets and further alienated the population from the state. Trade, once a hallmark of Roman prosperity, also suffered during this period. The interconnected network of roads and sea routes that had facilitated commerce began to deteriorate. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade routes and piracy increased in the Mediterranean, the flow of goods slowed to a trickle. Essential items such as grain from Egypt became harder to obtain, leading to shortages and higher prices. The decline in trade not only weakened the economy, but also created a sense of isolation among various parts of the empire, further fracturing its unity. Another critical aspect of Rome's economic instability was its dependence on the annona, or grain dole. This program provided free or subsidized grain to Roman citizens, particularly in the capital. While it was initially a political strategy to maintain loyalty and social order, it became a significant burden on the empire's finances. By the late empire, the annona was not only draining resources, but also fostering a culture of dependency. When disruptions to the grain supply occurred, riots and unrest were common, further destabilizing the state. The military also played a significant role in draining Rome's resources. The empire's vast borders required a large and well-equipped army, which was expensive to maintain. As the economy faltered, paying soldiers became increasingly difficult, leading to a reliance on foreign mercenaries who were often less loyal and more expensive. This created a vicious cycle. The empire needed a strong military to protect its borders and maintain order, but the costs of the military were one of the primary causes of its economic decline. Finally, corruption and mismanagement were rampant throughout the empire. Local officials often pocketed tax revenues, leaving the central government short on funds. This corruption extended to the highest levels, with emperors and senators more concerned with personal enrichment than the welfare of the state. The resulting inefficiency meant that even when resources were available, they were often squandered or misallocated. So, was Rome's economic collapse inevitable? Many historians argue that the empire's reliance on a slave-based economy and its failure to adapt to changing circumstances sealed its fate. Others suggest that better leadership and reforms might have prevented the worst of the decline. Regardless, the economic instability of Rome serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of inequality, corruption, and unsustainable practices. As we move deeper into this iceberg, we'll uncover even more surprising and obscure factors that contributed to Rome's fall. But for now, ask yourself, could Rome's economy have been saved, or was it always destined to crumble under its own weight? Barbarian invasions. The image of barbarian hordes sweeping across the Roman Empire, sacking cities and dismantling a once mighty civilization, is one of the most enduring stories of the fall of Rome. However, this oversimplifies a complex series of events that spanned centuries and involved a wide array of tribes, each with unique motives, relationships with Rome, and roles in its eventual collapse. These so-called barbarian invasions weren't simply waves of destruction, they were the result of migration, desperation, and Rome's own internal weaknesses. To understand the barbarian invasions, we first need to rethink the term barbarian. The word comes from the Greek barbaros, meaning anyone who didn't speak Greek or Latin. In Rome's eyes, these groups, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Huns, Franks, and others, were outsiders, defined more by their foreignness than by any shared cultural identity. Yet, many of these so-called barbarians had been interacting with Rome for generations, trading, serving as allies, and even fighting in its armies. One of the pivotal moments in this saga was the arrival of the Visigoths. Pressured by the advancing Huns in the late 4th century, the Visigoths sought refuge within Roman borders. Initially granted asylum, they were mistreated by Roman officials, leading to rebellion. The culmination of this tension came in 378 AD at the Battle of Adrianople, where the Visigoths decisively defeated a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. This event not only exposed Rome's military vulnerabilities, but also marked the beginning of a new era where barbarian groups would no longer be mere nuisances on the empire's fringes, but key players in its history. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, under Alaric I, famously sacked Rome. While the city was no longer the empire's political capital, its symbolic importance was immense. For centuries, Rome had been the eternal city, the heart of an empire that claimed dominion over the known world. Its fall to a foreign force sent shockwaves throughout the Mediterranean. Yet, Alaric's motivations weren't purely destructive. His goal was to secure land and recognition for his people. The sack of Rome was as much a negotiation tactic as an act of war. The Vandals, another key group, took a different approach. In 455 AD, they sacked Rome with a level of thoroughness that left a lasting impression, so much so that their name became synonymous with senseless destruction. But the Vandals were more than marauders. Under King Gaiseric, they established a powerful kingdom in North Africa, controlling critical trade routes and grain supplies. Their dominance of the Mediterranean posed a significant challenge to the Roman Empire, both economically and militarily. Perhaps the most fearsome of the so-called barbarians were the Huns, led by the legendary Attila. The Huns were a nomadic people from Central Asia, who arrived in Europe in the 4th century, spreading fear wherever they went. Attila's campaigns brought devastation to both Roman and barbarian lands, as he extracted tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire and launched invasions into the West. While Attila's forces never captured Rome itself, their incursions destabilized the Western Empire, forcing it to divert resources and alliances in desperate attempts to counter the threat. The fall of Rome to these groups wasn't solely the result of their invasions. Internal divisions within the empire played a critical role. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was politically fragmented, economically strained, and militarily reliant on barbarian mercenaries. In many cases, these mercenaries turned against their employers, seizing power for themselves. For instance, Odoacer, a chieftain of mixed barbarian heritage, deposed the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, a date traditionally seen as the end of the Western Roman Empire. Geography also played a role in the invasions. The vast borders of the empire, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, were increasingly difficult to defend. Natural barriers like the Rhine and Danube rivers, once seen as formidable defenses, became entry points as Rome's ability to patrol and fortify them weakened. The migration and invasions of barbarian groups weren't always hostile. In many cases, they were driven by necessity. Climate changes, resource scarcity, and pressure from other tribes forced many groups to move, often seeking refuge within Roman territory. It's worth noting that these invasions weren't universally catastrophic. In some cases, they led to the fusion of Roman and barbarian cultures, giving rise to new kingdoms that would shape medieval Europe. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, and the Ostrogoths in Italy all preserved elements of Roman governance, law, and culture, while blending them with their traditions. So, were the barbarian invasions the cause of Rome's fall, or were they the final blow to an empire already in decline? Historians continue to debate this question. What's clear is that these invasions revealed Rome's vulnerabilities, its overextended borders, reliance on mercenaries, and inability to adapt to changing circumstances. As we descend further into this iceberg, we'll explore even more mysterious and hidden factors behind Rome's fall. But for now, consider this. Were the barbarian invasions inevitable, or could Rome have forged a different fate through diplomacy, integration, or military reform? Internal political corruption. While external pressures like barbarian invasions are often blamed for the fall of Rome, the empire was already rotting from within. Political corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of stable leadership created an environment where the empire's internal structures began to crumble long before outside forces delivered the final blows. Rome's political system, once celebrated for its innovation, became a shadow of itself, plagued by power struggles, betrayal, and a failure to address the needs of its people. One of the most glaring issues was the sheer instability of leadership in the later years of the empire. During the 3rd century AD, Rome entered a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, during which over 20 emperors ruled in just 50 years. Many of these emperors came to power through military coups, and their reigns were often cut short by assassination or rebellion. This constant turnover weakened the central government and eroded trust among the population. The role of the Praetorian Guard, originally established to protect the emperor, became a symbol of this dysfunction. By the late Empire, the Praetorian Guard frequently acted as kingmakers, using their power to depose emperors and install new ones in exchange for bribes. This fostered a culture of corruption where loyalty was bought rather than earned, and Rome's highest office became a pawn in a dangerous game of political intrigue. Corruption wasn't limited to the imperial court. Across the empire, local governors and officials abused their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the state and its citizens. Tax collection, a critical function of government, became riddled with fraud. Instead of funneling money to the central government, many tax collectors pocketed a significant portion of the revenue, leaving the empire underfunded and unable to maintain its infrastructure or military. The Senate, once a prestigious institution central to Rome's governance, had also lost its influence. By the time of the late Empire, the Senate was little more than a ceremonial body, with real power concentrated in the hands of the emperor and his court. Many senators were more interested in preserving their wealth and privileges than addressing the empire's mounting problems. This detachment from the realities of governance contributed to the growing disconnect between Rome's elite and its populace. Another critical issue was the decentralization of power. As the empire grew, it became increasingly difficult to govern from a single location. In response, Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into the Eastern and Western Roman empires in 285 AD, each with its own emperor. While this temporarily stabilized the situation, it also created competition and tension between the two halves. Resources were often diverted to one side at the expense of the other, and cooperation between the two emperors was inconsistent at best. Religious conflict further destabilized the political landscape. The rise of Christianity, while ultimately a unifying force in later centuries, caused significant upheaval during its early adoption. Pagan traditions, once central to Roman identity, clashed with the growing Christian movement. Emperors like Constantine embraced Christianity, while others, such as Julian the Apostate, attempted to restore paganism. These shifts not only divided the populace, but also distracted the government from addressing more pressing issues. One of the most telling examples of political corruption was the rise of usurpers. Ambitious generals and governors often declared themselves emperor, leading to civil wars that drained the empire's resources and weakened its ability to respond to external threats. For instance, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire was fragmented into 3 rival states: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the core Roman Empire. Though eventually reunited, the damage caused by this division left lasting scars. Even the process of lawmaking became a tool for corruption and exploitation. Wealthy elites often influenced legislation to serve their interests, creating laws that protected their landholdings and exempted them from certain taxes. This further widened the gap between the rich and poor, fueling social unrest. So why didn't Rome's leaders address these issues? Part of the problem was a lack of foresight. Many emperors were more focused on short-term gains, whether through military conquest, lavish public works, or personal enrichment, than on the long-term stability of the empire. Additionally, the scale of Rome's problems made them difficult to solve. By the time reforms were proposed, the empire was often already facing a crisis that demanded immediate attention, leaving little room for meaningful change. As we move deeper into the iceberg, we'll see how these political failures intersected with other factors, creating a perfect storm that led to Rome's downfall. But for now, consider this. Was Rome's political system doomed to fail, or could it have been reformed to meet the challenges of a changing world? Tier 2. Beneath the surface military overextension. Rome's military was the backbone of its empire, responsible for its expansion, defense, and the projection of its power across 3 continents. Yet, by the time of its decline, this once formidable force had become a double-edged sword. Military overextension strained the empire's resources, weakened its defenses, and contributed significantly to its collapse. The very institution that had built Rome's greatness ultimately played a pivotal role in its undoing. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Euphrates River in the east, encompassing vast territories that required constant military presence to maintain. This presented a monumental logistical challenge. The Roman legions, though highly disciplined and effective, were spread thin across thousands of miles of borders, from the windswept moors of Britain to the deserts of North Africa. Protecting these borders required an enormous commitment of manpower and resources, which became increasingly difficult to sustain as the empire's economy faltered. One of the critical issues was the empire's reliance on fixed fortifications to defend its borders. Structures like Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Limes Germanicus along the Rhine were impressive feats of engineering, but they also represented a shift in strategy. Instead of the aggressive expansionism that had characterized Rome in its early days, the empire adopted a defensive posture. While these fortifications were effective in some cases, they also tied down large numbers of troops who might have been better utilized elsewhere. As the empire expanded, it also faced challenges in recruiting enough soldiers to fill the ranks of its legions. The traditional Roman army had been composed of citizen soldiers who served out of a sense of duty and allegiance to the state. However, as the empire grew, this model became unsustainable. Increasingly, Rome turned to mercenaries and auxiliaries, non-Roman troops hired from various provinces and barbarian tribes. While these soldiers were often skilled and effective, they lacked the loyalty and discipline of traditional Roman legions. The reliance on mercenaries created a host of problems. For one, it drained the empire's treasury, as these troops demanded higher wages and often refused to fight without payment. Additionally, mercenaries were frequently more loyal to their commanders than to the empire itself. In several cases, mercenary generals used their positions to seize power, undermining the stability of the central government. Perhaps most troubling, these foreign troops sometimes turned against the empire, either defecting to enemy forces or carving out their own kingdoms within Roman territory. Another factor was the sheer cost of maintaining Rome's military. By the 4th century, the empire was spending an estimated half of its annual budget on the army. This financial burden strained an already weakened economy and forced the government to resort to desperate measures, such as increasing taxes, debasing the currency, and cutting other critical expenditures. These measures, in turn, fueled social unrest and further eroded the empire's stability. Rome's military challenges were compounded by internal divisions. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves under Diocletian created coordination problems, particularly when it came to defense. While the Eastern Roman Empire, with its wealthier cities and more defensible borders, was able to withstand many of the challenges it faced, the Western Roman Empire was far more vulnerable. Resources and troops were often siphoned off to defend the East, leaving the West exposed to invasions and internal strife. Perhaps the most infamous example of Rome's military overextension was its inability to defend against barbarian incursions. By the late 4th century, the empire faced constant pressure from groups such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where the Roman army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Visigoths, is often cited as a turning point. This loss not only weakened Rome's military, but also emboldened other barbarian groups to invade Roman territory. Adding to these challenges was the changing nature of warfare. Rome's enemies adapted to its tactics, developing strategies that exploited the empire's weaknesses. The mobility and speed of barbarian raiders, for example, often outpaced Rome's ability to respond. The empire's heavy reliance on infantry, while effective in traditional battles, struggled against these more agile foes. The final blow came when the Western Roman Empire could no longer sustain its military infrastructure. Cities like Rome and Ravenna, once bastions of power, were left undefended as the empire's resources were depleted. In 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked Rome, a shocking event that symbolized the end of an era. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had effectively ceased to exist, its remnants absorbed into the emerging kingdoms of medieval Europe. Rome's military overextension is a cautionary tale of how even the strongest institutions can collapse under the weight of their own success. The empire's vast borders, reliance on mercenaries, and inability to adapt to changing circumstances created a situation where its military, once its greatest strength, became a liability. As we descend further into this iceberg, we'll explore even deeper and more obscure causes of Rome's fall. But for now, consider this. Could Rome have survived with a smaller, more concentrated military? Or was its sheer size always destined to be its undoing? Political instability and corruption. The Roman Empire's political system, which had been one of the most sophisticated and enduring in history, began to unravel long before the final collapse of the Western Empire. Political instability and corruption eroded the foundations of Roman governance, creating an environment of chaos and mistrust that made the empire increasingly vulnerable to external and internal pressures. One of the most glaring issues was the frequent change of emperors during the late Empire. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, Rome saw more than 20 emperors ascend to the throne, most of whom were military leaders who seized power through force. These rapid successions, often the result of assassinations or coups, destabilized the empire and undermined the authority of the central government. The loyalty of the army became the primary determinant of an emperor's survival, which led to a system where soldiers could essentially auction off the throne to the highest bidder. This era of constant upheaval severely weakened Rome's ability to govern effectively. Administrative tasks, including tax collection, legal enforcement, and the maintenance of public infrastructure, were neglected as resources were diverted to deal with political crises. Provincial governors, sensing the central government's weakness, often acted with impunity, pursuing their own agendas rather than those of the empire. This decentralization further eroded Rome's unity and ability to respond to challenges. Corruption was another pervasive problem. Roman officials at all levels of government were notorious for exploiting their positions for personal gain. Bribery, embezzlement, and favoritism became commonplace, undermining public trust in the government. The tax system, already overburdened by the empire's financial needs, was rife with abuse. Wealthy landowners often bribed tax collectors to reduce their obligations, leaving the poorer classes to shoulder a disproportionate burden. This inequality fueled resentment and rebellion, particularly in the provinces. The Senate, once the heart of Roman political life, had become largely irrelevant by the late empire. While senators continued to hold ceremonial roles, real power lay with the emperor and his court. This centralization of authority made the empire more vulnerable to the whims and incompetence of individual rulers. Several emperors, such as Nero and Commodus, are infamous for their misrule, prioritizing personal indulgence and vanity projects over the needs of the state. One of the most damaging aspects of political instability was its impact on the military. As mentioned earlier, the loyalty of the army was often tied to the promise of rewards, such as land and money. To secure their positions, emperors frequently depleted the treasury to pay off soldiers or raise taxes to unsustainable levels. This created a vicious cycle. Economic instability fueled political instability, which in turn weakened the military and the economy further. Another significant issue was the division of the empire into eastern and western halves. While this was initially intended as a practical solution to the challenges of governing such a vast territory, it had unintended consequences. The two halves often found themselves at odds, competing for resources and military support. When Rome faced invasions or internal uprisings, the eastern and western courts were often slow to cooperate if they did at all. This lack of coordination weakened the empire's ability to respond to crises and created opportunities for external enemies to exploit. Religious conflicts also played a role in the empire's political instability. The rise of Christianity, while ultimately transformative for Europe, created significant tensions in its early stages. Pagan officials and traditionalists resisted the growing influence of the Christian Church, while Christian emperors like Constantine and Theodosius implemented policies that marginalized pagan practices. These conflicts not only divided the ruling class, but also alienated segments of the population. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Rome's political decline was the erosion of civic virtue. In its early days, Roman society had been characterized by a sense of duty and collective responsibility. By the late empire, however, this ethos had largely disappeared. Public offices, once seen as an honor and a duty, were now viewed primarily as opportunities for personal enrichment. Citizens became increasingly disengaged from the political process, retreating into private life, or focusing on local concerns rather than the welfare of the empire as a whole. The cumulative effect of these factors was a government that was unable to adapt to the challenges it faced. Rome's political system, which had been one of its greatest strengths, became a liability as it failed to provide stability or effective leadership. This weakness was exploited by barbarian groups who found it easier to conquer an empire that was already divided and disorganized. As we move deeper into this iceberg, we'll uncover even darker and more obscure causes behind Rome's fall. But for now, ask yourself, was the collapse of Rome inevitable once its political system began to decay? Or could a single strong leader have turned the tide? Cultural decline. Cultural decline is a less tangible but equally significant factor in the fall of the Roman Empire. The cultural fabric that had once unified and defined Rome began to unravel during the late Empire, contributing to its vulnerability. While Rome's decline is often attributed to political, economic, and military failures, the erosion of its shared identity and values played a critical, if subtle, role in its collapse. One of the most striking signs of cultural decline was the loss of civic pride and participation. In the early days of the Republic and even during the height of the Empire, Romans took immense pride in their city and their role in its success. Public service was considered an honor, and many of Rome's wealthiest citizens donated time and resources to building infrastructure, sponsoring games, and supporting the arts. By the late Empire, however, this sense of duty had largely disappeared. Elites were more concerned with maintaining their personal wealth and status than contributing to the public good, and the lower classes became increasingly disillusioned with a system that offered them little in return. The decline of traditional Roman values such as discipline, hard work, and loyalty also contributed to the empire's downfall. The earlier Romans had adhered to a strict moral code rooted in the principles of the Republic, emphasizing duty to family, community, and the state. By the late Empire, these values had eroded, replaced by decadence, self-indulgence, and a pervasive sense of entitlement. Gladiatorial games, once seen as a celebration of Roman strength and resilience, devolved into spectacles of excess, with emperors and elites using them to distract the masses from the empire's worsening problems. Education and intellectual pursuits also suffered during this period. In the early empire, Rome was a hub of learning, with scholars, philosophers, and scientists making significant contributions to knowledge. Greek and Roman culture merged to create a rich intellectual tradition that influenced everything from architecture to literature. By the late Empire, however, the focus on education had waned. Schools and academies struggled to survive as funding dried up, and literacy rates declined among the general population. Without a strong intellectual foundation, the empire lost its ability to innovate and adapt to changing circumstances. Religious transformation played a dual role in the cultural decline of Rome. The rise of Christianity brought profound changes to the empire's cultural identity. While it eventually became a unifying force in Europe, Christianity initially created divisions within Roman society. Traditionalists who adhered to pagan beliefs viewed the spread of Christianity as a threat to their way of life, while Christians often distanced themselves from the empire's traditional values and practices. This cultural rift weakened Rome's social cohesion at a time when unity was desperately needed. Furthermore, the Christian emphasis on the afterlife and spiritual matters led some to view earthly responsibilities such as governance and military service as less important. This shift in priorities may have contributed to a decline in civic engagement and the empire's ability to mobilize its population effectively. However, it's worth noting that many Christian leaders and thinkers, such as Augustine of Hippo, sought to reconcile their faith with the practical needs of the state, advocating for moral and ethical governance. Another symptom of cultural decline was the increasing reliance on foreign influences. As the empire expanded, it absorbed countless cultures, languages, and traditions which initially enriched Roman society. However, by the late empire, this cultural diversity became a source of division rather than strength. The blending of cultures often diluted traditional Roman identity, creating tensions between Roman citizens and the growing number of barbarian inhabitants within the empire. Art and architecture, once symbols of Rome's greatness, also reflected the empire's decline. The grand public works of earlier centuries, such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon, gave way to smaller, less ambitious projects. The quality of craftsmanship diminished, and the focus shifted from celebrating Rome's achievements to preserving what little remained. This decline in artistic expression mirrored the empire's loss of confidence and ambition. The breakdown of cultural cohesion also had practical consequences. Rome's diverse population, which had once been united by a shared sense of purpose and identity, began to fragment. Provincial elites often prioritized local interests over imperial ones, and regional cultures reasserted themselves in ways that undermined the empire's unity. This decentralization of cultural identity made it easier for external forces to exploit divisions within the empire. Ultimately, the cultural decline of Rome was both a symptom and a cause of its broader collapse. As the empire lost its sense of identity and purpose, it became increasingly difficult to inspire loyalty and cooperation among its citizens. Without a unifying culture to bind its diverse population, Rome became a patchwork of competing interests, unable to muster the collective effort needed to address its challenges. As we descend further into the iceberg, the next layer will reveal even more hidden and obscure causes of Rome's fall. But for now, consider this. Was Rome's cultural decline inevitable in such a vast and diverse empire? Or could stronger leadership have preserved the values that once made it great? Tier 3. The hidden depths, environmental factors, and climate change. While political, economic, and military challenges dominate discussions about the fall of Rome, environmental factors and climate change played a significant and often overlooked role in the empire's decline. The environment, long a silent partner in Rome's success, turned into a silent adversary, creating conditions that exacerbated the empire's vulnerabilities. One of the most impactful environmental changes during Rome's decline was the shift in climate. Between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD, the Mediterranean region experienced significant cooling, a period known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. This cooling disrupted traditional agricultural practices, which were the backbone of the Roman economy and food supply. Crops that had thrived in warmer conditions struggled to grow, leading to reduced yields and widespread food shortages. The effects were particularly devastating for regions like North Africa and Egypt, which were critical sources of grain for the empire. The Nile River, whose regular flooding had sustained Egyptian agriculture for centuries, became less predictable. Droughts and irregular flood patterns disrupted the production and export of grain, creating ripple effects throughout the empire. Rome's reliance on imported grain meant that any disruption to these supply chains led to starvation, riots, and political instability. Deforestation and soil degradation further compounded these issues. As the Roman population grew, so did the demand for timber, farmland, and other natural resources. Forests were cleared on a massive scale to make way for agriculture and to provide wood for construction and fuel. Over time, this deforestation led to soil erosion, reducing the fertility of farmland. In addition, intensive farming practices such as overgrazing and the constant planting of the same crops depleted the soil of essential nutrients. The result was a gradual decline in agricultural productivity that left the empire unable to sustain its population. Environmental challenges also contributed to the migration of barbarian groups into Roman territory. Climate change did not only affect Rome, but also the regions to its north and east. Prolonged droughts and cooling temperatures in Central Asia and Eastern Europe forced nomadic groups, such as the Huns and the Goths, to seek new lands and resources. As these groups moved westward, they displaced other tribes, creating a domino effect of migrations that ultimately brought them into conflict with Rome. One of the most infamous environmental disasters of this period was the eruption of the Ilopango volcano in modern-day El Salvador, around 536 IADD. While this event occurred after the Western Roman Empire had fallen, it provides insight into the types of environmental challenges the late empire might have faced. The eruption spewed massive amounts of ash into the atmosphere, leading to a volcanic winter that caused global temperatures to plummet. Crop failures and famine followed, further destabilizing the remnants of the Roman world and its successor states. Rome's urban centers were also vulnerable to environmental pressures. The sprawling city of Rome, with its population of over 1 million people at its height, relied heavily on a complex system of aqueducts to provide water. As the empire's infrastructure deteriorated due to neglect and invasions, these aqueducts fell into disrepair. Access to clean water became increasingly unreliable, leading to outbreaks of disease and a decline in living standards. Speaking of disease, the Roman Empire was repeatedly struck by plagues that had environmental origins. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 AD, believed to have been caused by smallpox or measles, killed millions of people, and weakened the empire's military and economy. The Plague of Cyprian, 249 to 262 AD, was another catastrophic epidemic, causing widespread mortality and further destabilizing the empire. These pandemics were often exacerbated by Rome's urban density, poor sanitation, and reliance on long-distance trade, which facilitated the spread of pathogens. Environmental factors also influenced Rome's ability to defend itself. The freezing of rivers like the Rhine during harsh winters allowed barbarian groups to cross into Roman territory more easily. Additionally, the empire's reliance on agriculture to fund its military meant that food shortages often translated into poorly equipped and underfed soldiers, weakening Rome's ability to repel invasions. The Roman response to these environmental challenges was mixed. While some leaders attempted to implement reforms such as improving irrigation systems or encouraging crop diversification, these measures were often too little, too late. The empire's vast bureaucracy, once a strength, became a hindrance as it struggled to coordinate effective responses to environmental crises. Corruption and inefficiency further undermined these efforts, leaving many regions to fend for themselves. In hindsight, it's clear that environmental factors were not the sole cause of Rome's fall, but they acted as a powerful catalyst that accelerated the empire's decline. The interplay between environmental changes and human decisions created a perfect storm of challenges that Rome was ill-equipped to face. As we continue into the darker layers of this iceberg, we'll explore even more obscure and enigmatic causes behind Rome's fall. But for now, consider this. Could Rome have adapted to its changing environment, or was its reliance on a fragile ecological balance always destined to fail? Technological stagnation. The Roman Empire was renowned for its technological and engineering achievements, from aqueducts and roads to monumental architecture like the Colosseum. However, by the time of its decline, Rome's technological innovation had largely stagnated, leaving the empire unable to adapt to new challenges or compete with emerging powers. This stagnation, while less discussed than military or economic factors, played a crucial role in Rome's eventual downfall. In its earlier centuries, Rome was a beacon of innovation. The empire developed advanced engineering techniques that allowed it to construct infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. Roman concrete, for example, was a revolutionary building material that enabled the construction of durable structures like the Pantheon, which still stands today. Was Rome's technological stagnation inevitable? Some historians argue that the empire's reliance on a slave-based economy and its centralized bureaucracy created systemic barriers to innovation. Others suggest that external pressures such as invasions and resource shortages simply left Rome with little capacity to focus on technological progress. As we prepare to descend further into the iceberg, the next layer will delve into even more obscure and enigmatic factors behind Rome's fall. But for now, consider this. Could a renewed focus on innovation have saved the Roman Empire? Or were its systemic issues too deeply entrenched to overcome? Religious shifts and internal divisions. One of the most notable examples of these divisions was the Arian controversy, which revolved around the nature of Christ. Arians, who believed that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, clashed with Nicene Christians, who upheld the doctrine of the Trinity. These theological disputes often escalated into violent confrontations, with cities divided along religious lines. Councils like the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD were convened to resolve these issues, but they often highlighted the depth of the divisions rather than bridging them. These religious conflicts were further exacerbated by imperial involvement. Emperors frequently sided with one faction over another, using religion as a tool to consolidate power or suppress dissent. For instance, Emperor Constantius II, a staunch supporter of Arianism, persecuted Nicene Christians, alienating large portions of the population. Later, Emperor Theodosius I declared Nicene Christianity the official state religion and outlawed pagan practices, further marginalizing traditionalists and fueling resentment. The suppression of paganism wasn't just a cultural shift, it had tangible consequences for the empire's stability. Temples were closed, festivals banned, and sacred traditions abandoned. The dismantling of these institutions left a void in Roman society, as they had served not only as centers of worship but also as hubs for social and economic activity. The loss of these communal spaces weakened the social cohesion that had once united diverse communities under the Roman banner. Christianity's rise also altered Rome's approach to governance and warfare. Traditional Roman religion had been deeply intertwined with the state, with emperors often portrayed as divine or semi-divine figures. This association bolstered their authority and legitimacy. However, Christianity rejected the notion of divine emperors, emphasizing the supremacy of God over earthly rulers. While this shift aligned with Christian teachings, it undermined the traditional authority of the emperor and contributed to political instability. On the battlefield, the influence of Christianity introduced new challenges. Early Christian teachings emphasized pacifism, which conflicted with the militaristic ethos that had defined Roman culture for centuries. While the Church eventually reconciled its stance on warfare, the initial reluctance among Christian leaders to support military campaigns created tensions within the empire. Soldiers who converted to Christianity sometimes faced dilemmas about participating in battles, leading to questions about loyalty and discipline. The religious shift also had economic repercussions. Pagan temples, which had been major landowners and patrons of the arts, lost their funding and influence as Christianity became the dominant faith. This reallocation of resources disrupted local economies and contributed to the decline of traditional industries. Furthermore, the Church's exemption from taxation placed additional strain on an already overburdened state. Despite these challenges, Christianity also brought new strengths to the empire. The Church provided a unifying framework during a time of fragmentation, offering social services, education, and charity to the poor. Christian bishops often acted as mediators in political disputes, and the Church's hierarchical structure mirrored that of the empire, helping to maintain order in a time of chaos. Still, the overall impact of religious shifts on the Roman Empire was deeply ambivalent. While Christianity offered new forms of unity, it also introduced divisions that the empire struggled to reconcile. Theologians and historians continue to debate whether the rise of Christianity hastened Rome's decline or simply reflected the broader transformations already underway. As we move deeper into the iceberg, the next topic will explore even more hidden and enigmatic factors that contributed to the empire's fall. But for now, consider this. Was the Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity a saving grace or a fatal fracture? Environmental changes and resource depletion. As the Roman Empire expanded, it drew heavily on its natural environment to sustain its growing population, infrastructure, and military. However, by the time of its decline, environmental degradation and resource depletion had become significant challenges, undermining the empire's ability to function effectively. These issues, though less discussed than military or political factors, played a crucial role in Rome's fall. One of the most pressing environmental issues was deforestation. The construction of Rome's vast infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and monumental buildings, required enormous quantities of timber. Additionally, wood was the primary source of fuel for heating, cooking, and metalworking. Over centuries, the relentless demand for timber led to widespread deforestation, particularly in regions like Italy, Gaul, and the Balkans. Deforestation had cascading effects on the environment and economy. Soil erosion became a major problem in deforested areas, reducing agricultural productivity. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, rainwater washed away fertile topsoil, leaving fields barren and unable to support crops. This decline in agricultural output exacerbated food shortages and contributed to social unrest. Furthermore, the loss of forests reduced biodiversity and disrupted local ecosystems, making it harder for communities to rely on hunting or foraging to supplement their diets. Another critical issue was the overuse of arable land. Roman agricultural practices, while advanced for their time, often prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Intensive farming depleted the soil of essential nutrients, leading to declining yields. Crop rotation and fallowing, techniques used to restore soil fertility, were not widely practiced in the empire. As a result, once productive farmland became increasingly unproductive, forcing the Romans to rely on grain imports from provinces like Egypt and North Africa. Climate change also played a role in the empire's struggles. Recent studies of ice cores and tree rings suggest that the Roman Empire experienced a period of climatic instability during its later years. A shift to cooler and wetter conditions, known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, disrupted agricultural production across Europe and the Mediterranean. Crops like wheat and grapes, which thrived in stable climates, struggled to adapt to these changes, leading to frequent famines. Water management, a hallmark of Roman engineering, began to falter during this period. The aqueducts that had supplied cities with clean water were often neglected or damaged during invasions. In some cases, invading forces deliberately destroyed these vital structures to weaken Roman resistance. Without reliable access to clean water, cities faced outbreaks of disease and declining public hygiene. The reduced availability of water also affected agriculture and industry, further straining the empire's resources. Mining, another critical industry, also experienced decline due to resource exhaustion. The Roman Empire was heavily dependent on metals like gold, silver, and lead for its economy and administration. Coins, for instance, were minted from precious metals extracted from mines across the empire. However, by the late empire, many of these mines had been depleted, forcing the Romans to rely on increasingly marginal sources. The scarcity of resources contributed to economic instability, as the empire struggled to maintain its monetary system and trade networks. The depletion of resources also had social and political consequences. As natural resources became scarcer, competition for them intensified. Provinces that had once provided grain, timber, or minerals to the empire began to withhold supplies, either due to local shortages or as a form of resistance against imperial authority. This eroded the cohesion of the empire as regions prioritized their own survival over the needs of the central government. Additionally, environmental pressures exacerbated tensions between urban and rural populations. Cities, reliant on resources from the countryside, placed heavy demands on rural communities. These demands often took the form of taxes, labor, or requisitioned goods, leaving rural populations impoverished and resentful. In some cases, rural inhabitants abandoned their lands altogether, fleeing to cities or seeking refuge with barbarian groups. This rural depopulation further weakened the empire's agricultural base and contributed to its economic decline. Despite these challenges, the Romans were not entirely passive in the face of environmental problems. Some emperors attempted reforms to address resource shortages and promote sustainability. For example, laws were enacted to protect forests and regulate logging. Efforts were also made to improve agricultural practices and rehabilitate degraded land. However, these measures were often too little, too late, and they struggled to overcome the systemic issues that had developed over centuries. The environmental challenges faced by the Roman Empire serve as a stark reminder of the importance of sustainable resource management. While the Romans were pioneers in many areas of engineering and agriculture, their inability to adapt to changing environmental conditions ultimately contributed to their decline. As we continue our descent into the iceberg, the next topic will uncover even more obscure and enigmatic factors behind the empire's collapse. For now, consider this. Was the fall of Rome an inevitable consequence of environmental degradation, or could the empire have found a way to sustain itself in the face of these challenges? Tier 4. The Abyss. Shifts in trade and economic dependency. Trade was one of the cornerstones of the Roman Empire's prosperity, facilitating the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas across its vast territories. However, as the empire entered its decline, shifts in trade networks and an increasing dependency on vulnerable supply chains became critical weaknesses. While trade once symbolized the strength and connectivity of Rome, it ultimately revealed fractures that contributed to the empire's collapse. At its height, Rome's trade network was a marvel of the ancient world. Goods like grain, olive oil, wine, and textiles flowed freely across the empire, while luxury items such as silk, spices, and exotic animals arrived from distant lands like India and China. This system relied on a complex web of roads, ports, and markets, all maintained by the empire's military and administrative infrastructure. The Mediterranean Sea, referred to by the Romans as Mare Nostrum, our sea, was the beating heart of this network, enabling efficient and relatively safe maritime trade. However, as the empire expanded, its reliance on external sources for essential goods grew. Provinces like Egypt and North Africa became vital suppliers of grain, which fed the empire's urban centers and supported its massive population. Any disruption to these supply lines could, and often did, result in widespread famine and unrest. The reliance on such critical imports left Rome vulnerable to both natural disasters and human interference. One of the most significant disruptions to trade came in the form of barbarian invasions. Beginning in the 3rd century AD, these incursions destabilized the western provinces, making overland trade routes increasingly unsafe. Cities and towns that had once thrived as hubs of commerce found themselves cut off, leading to economic stagnation and depopulation. The eastern provinces, centered around Constantinople, managed to maintain stronger trade links, but this only deepened the divide between the eastern and western halves of the empire. Piracy in the Mediterranean also posed a growing threat. While Rome had once dominated the seas, its declining naval power allowed pirates to operate with greater impunity. This not only disrupted the flow of goods but also increased the costs of trade, as merchants demanded higher prices to compensate for the risks. The loss of secure sea routes further isolated regions of the empire and contributed to the fragmentation of its economy. Economic dependency on trade also created social and political tensions. As Rome became increasingly reliant on imports, local economies suffered. Small farmers, unable to compete with cheap grain from Egypt, abandoned their lands and moved to cities in search of work. This rural depopulation weakened the empire's agricultural base and increased the strain on urban infrastructure. The urban poor, dependent on grain doles provided by the state, became a volatile and restive population, prone to rioting during periods of scarcity. The empire's monetary system also began to collapse under the weight of trade imbalances. Rome's economy was heavily reliant on the inflow of precious metals to mint coins and support commerce. However, as the empire ceased to expand, the supply of gold and silver from conquered territories dried up. To make matters worse, Rome imported more goods than it exported, particularly luxury items from the East. This created a drain on the empire's reserves of precious metals, leading to a chronic trade deficit. To address this deficit, Roman authorities resorted to debasing their currency, reducing the amount of gold and silver in coins while maintaining their nominal value. This practice led to rampant inflation as people lost confidence in the currency and demanded higher prices for goods. Trade slowed as a result, and the economy became increasingly localized, with barter replacing coinage in many regions. The shift to a localized economy had far-reaching consequences for the empire. As trade networks broke down, regions became more self-sufficient, but also more isolated. This economic fragmentation mirrored and reinforced the political fragmentation of the empire, as local leaders prioritized their own interests over those of the central government. The decline of long-distance trade also meant that cultural and technological exchanges slowed, contributing to the stagnation of innovation and the loss of knowledge. One of the most poignant symbols of Rome's declining trade is the fate of its once thriving cities. Urban centers like Rome, Carthage, and Trier, which had been bustling hubs of commerce and culture, entered periods of decline as trade dried up. Populations dwindled, infrastructure fell into disrepair, and the grandeur of these cities became a distant memory. Despite these challenges, the eastern half of the empire managed to preserve its trade networks to a greater extent. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, maintained strong connections with the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes. This economic resilience allowed the East to thrive even as the West crumbled, highlighting the critical role that trade played in the survival or collapse of empires. In the end, the shifts in trade and economic dependency reveal a stark truth about the Roman Empire. Its interconnectedness, once a source of strength, became a vulnerability as external pressures mounted. The collapse of trade networks not only weakened Rome's economy, but also eroded the social and political bonds that had held the empire together. As we continue deeper into this iceberg, the next topic will explore a factor even more elusive and mysterious than economic dependency. But for now, consider this. Could a stronger trade policy or better resource management have saved the Roman Empire, or was its decline inevitable in a world of shifting alliances and growing threats, the role of religion and internal divisions? Religion had always played a central role in the Roman Empire, from its traditional pantheon of gods to the eventual rise of Christianity. While faith brought communities together and shaped cultural identity, it also became a source of division and conflict, especially during the empire's decline. The interplay between religious change and internal divisions reveals a complex and often contentious chapter in Rome's history. At its peak, the Roman Empire was known for its polytheistic religion, a system that emphasized civic unity and collective worship. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and other gods were focal points of public life, and rituals were closely tied to the state's well-being. However, as the empire expanded, it encountered new religions and spiritual movements that challenged this traditional system. Christianity was the most influential of these new religions, growing from a small sect in Judea to the dominant faith of the empire. This transformation began in earnest during the reign of Emperor Constantine, who issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting religious tolerance to Christians. By the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius I had declared Christianity the state religion and banned pagan practices. While the Christianization of Rome is often seen as a unifying force, it also introduced significant internal divisions. Pagan communities, which had long been integral to Roman culture, found themselves marginalized and at odds with the Christian majority. Temples were closed, statues of gods were defaced, and traditional rituals were outlawed, creating resentment and resistance among those who clung to the old ways. The church itself was not immune to division. Debates over theological doctrine, such as the nature of Christ or the concept of the Trinity, led to bitter disputes and the formation of rival factions. The Arian controversy, for example, divided the church for centuries and even influenced political alliances. These disputes often spilled into the secular realm, with emperors intervening in religious matters to assert their authority or curry favor with influential bishops. Religious conflicts also had a geographic dimension, contributing to the growing divide between the eastern and western halves of the empire. The East, with its intellectual centers like Alexandria and Antioch, became a hotbed of theological debate and innovation. The West, meanwhile, was more conservative and often struggled to keep up with the rapid changes in religious doctrine. This cultural and religious divergence mirrored the political and economic rift that was already weakening the empire. The rise of monasticism in the 4th and 5th centuries further complicated the relationship between religion and the state. Monks and hermits who sought to renounce worldly pursuits in favor of spiritual devotion often criticized the opulence and corruption of the Roman elite. While their ascetic lifestyle inspired many, it also highlighted the moral and social decay of the empire. Some monasteries became centers of learning and preservation, but their withdrawal from public life symbolized the fragmentation of Roman society. The decline of traditional religious practices also had practical consequences for the empire. Pagan temples had long served as centers of economic activity, hosting markets and managing landholdings. As these institutions were dismantled, their resources were often misappropriated or fell into disuse. This disruption weakened local economies and eroded the social fabric of communities that had relied on the stability provided by these religious institutions. The adoption of Christianity also reshaped Rome's military. Many early Christians were pacifists who opposed violence, which created tension within an empire that relied on its army to maintain order and defend its borders. While this stance softened over time, with the Church eventually endorsing just war doctrine, the initial reluctance to serve in the military may have contributed to recruitment challenges during critical periods. Despite these challenges, Christianity also provided the empire with new sources of unity and resilience. The Church's hierarchical structure, modeled in part on Roman administrative systems, helped maintain order and communication across vast distances. Bishops often acted as mediators and leaders in times of crisis, filling the void left by a weakened imperial government. By the time of the empire's fall, religion had become both a source of division and a pillar of continuity. While the shift from paganism to Christianity introduced conflict and upheaval, it also laid the foundation for the Byzantine Empire and the eventual rise of medieval Christendom. As we prepare to descend into the final tier of this iceberg, consider this. Did the rise of Christianity save the Roman Empire from moral decay? Or did it hasten its collapse by undermining its traditional foundations? Tier 5. The depths, unexplained phenomena, and theories. At the very bottom of this iceberg lie the unexplained phenomena and theories surrounding the fall of Rome, ideas that defy conventional historical narratives. These theories blend historical evidence with mystery, highlighting the gaps in our understanding of how such a colossal empire could crumble. Whether grounded in emerging research or fueled by speculation, these topics push us to question whether the fall of Rome was a natural progression or something far more mysterious. One of the most debated mysteries is the role of climate change. In recent years, historians and scientists have begun to examine the environmental factors that may have contributed to Rome's decline. Evidence from ice cores and tree rings suggests that the empire experienced a period of significant climate instability during its final centuries. Droughts, harsh winters, and unpredictable weather patterns disrupted agriculture, leading to food shortages and economic stress. Some scholars have even linked this climatic shift to the volcanic eruptions of the late Roman period, which could have caused temporary volcanic winters by filling the atmosphere with ash and blocking sunlight. While climate change offers a compelling explanation for some of Rome's struggles, it raises more questions than it answers. Why did these environmental challenges impact Rome more severely than its neighbors? Were these climatic shifts part of a broader global pattern, or were they localized to the Mediterranean? Another intriguing theory involves the potential for pandemics to have played a decisive role. The Antonine Plague, which struck in the 2nd century AD, and the Plague of Cyprian, which followed in the 3rd century, are well-documented events that devastated the Roman population. However, some historians argue that an even deadlier outbreak may have occurred during the empire's final years. DNA evidence from ancient burial sites suggests the possible presence of bubonic plague, raising the question of whether an undocumented pandemic swept through Rome in the 5th century, further destabilizing an already fragile society. This idea dovetails with another mysterious phenomenon, the so-called Great Migration period. Beginning in the 4th century, waves of barbarian tribes moved into Roman territory, fleeing from an unknown threat. While some historians attribute this movement to the Huns and their campaigns of terror, others have speculated about a more enigmatic cause. Could a natural disaster, such as a catastrophic flood or famine in Central Asia, have triggered this mass migration? Or was it driven by something less tangible, like political upheaval or cultural shifts within these societies? The possibility of advanced knowledge or technology influencing Rome's decline has also sparked curiosity. Some researchers have pointed to the empire's over-reliance on lead, used in everything from plumbing to cosmetics. While it's widely accepted that lead poisoning was a problem for Roman elites, some fringe theories suggest that it may have had broader societal effects, dulling the population's intellect and weakening their ability to respond to crises. While this idea is largely speculative, it underscores the importance of understanding how environmental and technological factors intersected with human behavior. A more controversial theory involves the potential role of external or even extraterrestrial influences. Ancient texts and artifacts occasionally reference unexplained events, such as strange lights in the sky or unusual weather patterns. While mainstream historians view these accounts as folklore or natural phenomena, some proponents of fringe history have suggested that these events might point to outside intervention. Whether these theories hold any validity is debatable, but they illustrate how Rome's decline continues to capture the imagination of those seeking answers beyond the conventional. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the fall of Rome is its enduring uncertainty. Historians have spent centuries piecing together the puzzle of the empire's collapse, yet definitive answers remain elusive. This ambiguity allows room for speculative theories, but it also serves as a reminder of how complex and multifaceted historical events can be. In many ways, the fall of Rome isn't just a historical question, it's a philosophical one. How does a society as powerful and innovative as Rome fail to adapt to changing circumstances? Is the collapse of civilizations an inevitable cycle, or could it have been prevented with better leadership, unity, and foresight? As we conclude this journey through the iceberg, consider this. The fall of Rome is not just a story about the past, it's a warning for the future. What lessons can we learn from Rome's collapse, and how might they help us navigate the challenges of our own time? From the shocking economic collapses and political corruption to the mysterious climate shifts and unexplained migrations, this journey into the iceberg of Rome's fall has revealed a story far more complex than we often realize. Each layer exposed a new perspective, some rooted in undeniable facts, others shrouded in mystery. But one question remains. Was the fall of Rome truly inevitable, or did it hinge on decisions and events that could have unfolded differently? Could the empire have been saved, or are all great civilizations destined to fall? Let me know which theory or revelation surprised you the most in the comments below. If you've enjoyed uncovering the hidden depths of history with me, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the greatest mysteries of the past. And remember, the deeper we dig into history, the more questions we uncover. So what's the next iceberg you'd like to explore? Let me know, and until then, keep questioning the world around you.